So welcome to YouTube and Twitch and Discord and the Tiki Talkie. Welcome everyone. It's good to see you here. I have my cat giving me the side eye. I have a quarter cup of tea and one of the most triggering books I have ever read. Happy December. It is finally the end of 2025. Oh, hello Gonzo, welcome. And I'm so glad that the year is almost over. So let us begin. We are on chapter 6, which is page 125 of Pumla Dineo Gqola's Rape, a South African Nightmare. Chapter 6 is called Forked Tongue on Child Rape. Every now and then, our national newspapers or television announce news of a gruesome rape that involves an old woman, a baby, or a very small child. The entire nation seems to go into shock. Many call into radio stations to discuss again and again the devastating incomprehensibility of such barbarity. Nobody understands what this is about, caller after caller declares, so that we can almost touch the sadness carried in these voices. Because we are a number of reiterations. How can a grown man be aroused by a baby? A few more people will declare what a sick society we are. Some suggest that we need to return to a better sense of ethics or humanity or morality. Return in quotes here. And therefore, what exactly is meant by such a call? However, the pain and frustration is one I share. I'm pleased that we live in a country that refuses to be desensitized to the constant onslaught of rape, that we continue to be outraged, even if I find collective responses beyond shock and horror deeply inadequate. In 2001, baby Tsepang was one such case. One night in Louisville in the Northern Cape, 22-year-old Leah Boyson went looking for her abusive boyfriend, David Potse. When she could not immediately find him, she decided to check his other or ex-girlfriend's house. She was tired of waiting in bed for him. When she found him, he was raping baby Tsepang. She was so shocked, she dropped her match and had to light another one to confirm to herself what she had just seen. Potse continued to rape the 9-month-old child, even as she stared at him in disbelief. Too uncomfortable to keep watching, she went back to her house, where she resumed waiting for him in bed. I do not blame her for that response. How do you comprehend what you just witnessed, if it is that? Tsepang was so damaged that she needed emergency surgery. Potse's semen was found in the baby's nappy as well as on the blankets. Boyson, however, remained in an intimate relationship with Potse and admitted to being both his girlfriend and still in love with him when she testified against him during the court proceedings in Uppington. Potse was also either boyfriend or ex-boyfriend to Tsepang's mother, in a complicated story of overlapping relationships. In Potse Denies Rape of Tsepang, from how his semen came to be in the baby's rectum or her diaper that she had been wearing that same evening, and on blankets and towels on the bed. He could not explain how his semen had come to be on the evidence. Investigating officer Inspector Marina van der Merwe testified that after it had been ascertained that the forensic lab, that Potts's DNA profile matched the semen that had been found on the evidence, another blood sample was taken from him to make doubly sure. The result positive once again. In the case of excellent evidence collection, Potts's denials were rendered ridiculous. Investigators collected evidence and retested semen and blood samples to confirm the details contained in Boyson's testimony that placed him at the scene, in a very rare instance of rape with witness collaboration. This case is as heartbreaking as it is unusually consistent for a rape case. The correlation between the witness testimony and DNA and evidence collection is seldom as swift and effective as it was in this case. Potts's denial is ridiculous for other reasons. Because he raped a baby, he is unable, like others charged with rape, to argue that sex was consensual. Therefore, he does not have access to an explanation. He then feigns ignorance at how his semen was found on the baby, as though someone other than himself deposited it there. Here he tries to suggest that he was framed, an argument that has been cast as conspiracy in high-profile cases in South Africa before. However, Potse does not have the qualities required to make and successfully build such an argument. This is an argument that only makes sense for powerful, prominent men who have many suspected enemies and whose power is evident for all to see. The reason Potse's attempt at denying raping baby Tsebang ring hollow and has everything to do with who the raped and the rapists are. In addition to a witness and DNA evidence, Potse also fits the profile of who rapists are and his choice of who to rape, fitting a circulating idea of who is rapeable. Another remarkable aspect of this case is the behavior and identity of the witness, who is not swayed in her testimony. Potse and Boyson continued their relationship even as she testified against him, something which seems counterintuitive. Her resolve to narrate what she witnessed does not temper her feelings for him. She returns to the bed they shared, so he may return after he finished raping a baby. They are also both able to continue their relationship even as they stand on different sides of the law. Her decision to testify against him suggests her conviction that he should be held responsible for his illegal and harmful actions, and she decided not to protect him. Yet all of this does not temper her decision to be with him in an intimate relationship, and presumably doesn't make her wonder about the safety of her own children around him. The reasons why he stays with her are equally puzzling. Even in a context where rape is counterintuitive, the case offers layers of challenges to our understanding of human behavior, intimate partnerships, and motivation. Tsebang's teenage mother, herself a rape survivor, had left her child with a relative who became drunk, abandoning the child. What we are told was that the mother had also gone to drink before leaving Tsebang with the negligent relative. After arrest, Potse is reported to have threatened further harm to mother and baby. Potse's access to at least 2 girlfriends, as well as his choice of who to rape, make it hard to hold onto ideas of rape as sex. Even those who believe that rape survivors invite rape would be hard-pressed to show how a baby is capable of seduction and consent, hence the heightened sense of collective shock when we are confronted with news of children raped. Furthermore, Potse's decision to rape his girlfriend's child seems to confirm circulating ideas of child rapists as particularly depraved individuals. Tsebang's case received enormous attention with regular updates in the media as the baby underwent emergency treatment and extensive reconstructive surgery. Yet the sympathy reserved for a baby, the revulsion directed at Potse, did not always temper the way in which baby Tsebang's mother was shamed. Of course. The fact that she went drinking, leaving her child alone, seemed to add fuel to the fire. She didn't leave him alone. She didn't leave the child alone. Yet, anybody who takes care of little children knows that it's hard work, and any human being needs reprieve from such work. Middle-class women's magazines wax lyrical about the importance of finding me time away from children and work. This me time is considered not a luxury, but a crucial respite and recovery from hard work. It is this time that allows women to continue to take relationships with me time in the public imagination. It matters little, it seems, that baby Tsebang's mother did not leave her child unattended, even as in a society that continues to hold on to the myth that most black women have access to extended families who responsibly and rightly share parenting and childcare. She left her baby with another adult, and it is this second adult that left the child alone. However, even though the behavior of the second adult is clearly irresponsible, since there are many dangers that could befall a child if left unattended, she still cannot be held responsible for Potse's deciding to rape the baby. You do not expect somebody to rape your own child. Hi, Manny. It is not only her community that blamed baby Tsepang's mother for the rape of her baby. However, when her baby was taken away from her and she followed in order to be close to Tsepang, who was no longer in her care, her new schoolmates repeatedly taunted and shamed her for her child's rape. This case is one of compounded tragedies. The mother is herself a subject of intersecting forms of violence, poverty, her own rape, and the trauma that stems from this, the rape of her own baby, for which she is then punished through the removal of the baby, placed with foster parents in Cape Town. Having initially followed her baby to Cape Town so she could retain some contact, Tsepang's mother later returned to Louisville, where she continues to live with all the reminders of perhaps her own rape as well as the rape of her child. In such a story as this, many people rush to outline the links between socially degraded conditions of Tsepang's life, the poverty, unemployment, helplessness of many young people with limited responsibilities of self-improvement and escape, and some scholarship seems to confirm the likelihood of rape and other violent crime in conditions of such constant degradation. We cannot intellectualize our way out of this. There's never a way of intellectualizing any form of abuse such as this. Yeah, we can focus on behavior of the rapist, we can focus on the socioeconomic issues at play, but ultimately, it was his choice. He made a choice to rape. Anne Klein interviewed 10 men convicted of raping children under the age of 3. All Klein's interviewees were serving lengthy jail terms at the time of the interview, and they ranged from age 19 to 61. Klein is concerned with understanding the mentality of men such as these and chooses men who fall into the publicly circulated profile of child rapist. Unemployed at the time of raping children, all school dropouts, 3 suffered extreme institutional and personal violence as children. Each of these convicted child rapists had a heightened sexualized childhood. In other words, Klein's research seemed to confirm that there is a cycle of abuse and sexual violence in child rapists' lives. The men studied in Klein's dissertation seem very similar in location to Potsa, although we do not know enough about his childhood to confirm the presence of individual abuse or premature exposure to sexual contact. He is similar to those men in racial classification, class position, and impoverished background. Klein's study also reveals that all the child rapists she interviewed confessed to feeling immense anger on those days that the rape occurred, and that this anger was directed at men and women and sometimes related to the children they raped. Some of the children were related to these men and women. Klein was concerned with understanding the underlying factors for child rape and perhaps contributing to larger discussions about the kinds of interventions necessary. Although 10 interviewees drawn from similar personal backgrounds are a very small sample, Klein contributes to a large scholarly literature on understanding violent offenders. This is not really my concern here, so those who share Klein's curiosity and particular interest should be well served reading the full dissertation and some of the literature she references that is interested in linked behavioral, psychological, and psychiatric questions. What I'm going to do after this is try to get a hold of her research. Any questions so far? My toes are cold. In her 2014 address to the Northern Cape Provincial Legislature at the beginning of the 16 Days of No Violence Against Women and Children, then Public Protector Advocate Tuli Madonsela reportedly noted the importance of ending the impunity with which violence against women happens and understanding what turns people into monsters. For her, these two are linked. Impunity is a socially embedded phenomenon that comes from the absence of consequences for violence. And that is important. the absence of consequences. Advocate Madonsela continued, "We assume people will stop killing women and children when we arrest them and send them to jail. Do you think someone who rapes a 6-month-old baby is thinking about going to jail? I would never blame a woman for a man who rapes a child, for a man who beats up a woman. There's no reason anyone should beat up or rape a child. Children used to run around in Soweto and everywhere in society naked, and nobody raped them. However, we must reduce opportunities. Secondly, eliminates excuses and justifications. And thirdly, deepens understandings of the kinds of deterrence that could work. For if, as she argues, the threats of imprisonment and its unlikelihood are not the right deterrence, we need a clear investigation, and these cannot invest in victim blaming." Baby Tsepang's case received enormous publicity and inspired a play and other works. 3 recent cases received considerably less attention, and it is to these that I now turn. South Africa, that help us build a bigger picture and perhaps move closer to the kind of understanding that Advocate Madonsela wishes for. The first case is of the highly racialized case of rape at Jan Kempdorp High School, a Northern Cape boarding school, in February 2015, where several boys of different races watched. 19 to witness the violence intervened. The attackers shaved his head, painted him with a white substance, hung a board around his neck with his name and the name of his boss, quote unquote his boss, which is a highly racialized term, while other boys watched, joked, laughed, and recorded the one of a series of disturbing incidences at South African schools at the beginning of 2015. Consequently, initial responses saw it as primarily a racist incident by students. However, revelations of the it's frightening, not just because of the brutal attack, but also one that seems to throw up other questions about direct complicity, violent masculinities, and rape culture in schools. Okay, quick discussion. This morning or yesterday, and I had a multi-pronged response to it. I'll check it now. And I think it fits into my colonial masculinity theory. Sexual violence by white men, white boys over boys of color is rooted in colonialism and white men's sexual prowess, or trying to prove their prowess. Angela Davis writes a lot about this. Fanon writes a lot about this. Anne McClintock. Colonialism required domination of indigenous, black, and colonized women and men to establish white male supremacy as natural, inevitable, and God-given. So, sexual domination was one of the tools that it was to assert all white male access to all bodies in the colony, in every which way they possibly could, destroying indigenous kinship and gender systems, things like establishing racial hierarchy through breeding out, quote unquote, reinforcing the fantasy of white virility. And this is exactly the kind of the core to homosocial masculinity. Sexual violence is not about desire. It's explicitly not about desire. It's about proving manhood to other men, other white men, demonstrating racial entitlement, saying that your bodies belong to the empire. And this was a message for both victims and for the other men watching and hearing about it. Women, girls, boys, men raped as retaliation for anti-colonial uprisings, like in the Congo, like in the Herero and Nama genocide in Namibia, the Anglo-Boer War concentration camps, Algeria under French rule, in British India, especially during and after 1857, the starvations that were going on, African enslavement throughout the Americas, settler colonies in North America and Australia, The people of Maori descent were men Maori men were raped constantly by the colonizers that previously had multiple genders, matrilineal systems, egalitarian relations, and gender fluidity. And sexual violence literally enforced the gender binary and encouraged. And there you have white boys in post-apartheid South Africa raping a black child with a broom, saying, "We own you." Racialized sexual violence is never as simple as it's made out to be. While the student was tortured by 4 or 6 students, depending on which newspaper the report relies on, many more students watched his humiliation. What are the going on at schools, and to what extent versions of this kind of violence are possible at others? The Jan Kempdorp. Good night.
Yeah.
I love you.
Story. I remember that one story.
I remember too.
Of course. Yeah. There was they made a play about it. The Hilton Arts Festival.
Yeah. I love you.
Love you.
You're handsome. The Jan Kempdorp incident illustrates that much is wrong with the culture of masculinity and the pressure to be violent among young people. It really hit him hard. It shows the extent of racialized, gendered, masculine culture in parts of our society. In a country where violent masculinities cross boundaries of race, but where some forms of violent expression are more likely to be performed by some men rather than others, it is clear that boys and young men are not safe. This incident also shows the extent to which partaking in violent behavior, as well as spectatorship and demonstrated support of brutality, forms part of masculine peer pressure. I will, Taro. At the same time, this violence is deeply racialized. It means boss, but is essentially the South African equivalent to massa. It does not seem that the students in question were particularly shocked by the events, nor did the obvious pain experienced by the boy who was raped move them to empathy. Silence about brutality is a requirement, and indeed, journalist reporting hearing laughter and jokes. Various journalists report hearing laughter and jokes as the scene unfolded. I was a journalist at the time. The footage made its way to me. I refused to cover the story and I gave it to a colleague. While we may want to ask questions about how a majority of boys did not intervene, the 12 boy who was raped was a newcomer, and it seems that it was generally accepted that he was to be initiated, marking him as an outsider, as initiation often does. Many school initiation rituals rest on the humiliation of the newcomer before he can be accepted as a member of the new school community. Rape is not initiation. Initiation also demands secrecy by insiders on what happens, and patriarchal masculinity values its ability to keep the business of men away from others. It may well be that what was done to the new student did not differ radically from what other boys had been initiated to earlier. This is one way of explaining the failure of others to intervene, even if not to temper the extent of the violence. Part of why this was so disturbing is because adults like to pretend that initiation is harmless, that children cannot inflict long-lasting damage on one another, but secrecy, the ability to inflict violence, and the ability to remain stoic in the face of violence are ideals that a society such as ours habitually celebrates. It is the stuff that, quote-unquote, real men are made of. The fabric of heroism. This is partly why the young man's cries were met with laughter. All of these boys would be familiar with the oft-cited reminder that real men do not cry when faced with pain. To cry rendered him feminine in the same way that his public rape did. The initiation worked racially in similar ways to gendered meanings, on both planes. The grade 12 student was being broken and rendered submissive. I'm only separating the two to illustrate how the violence was as much about race as it was about gender, and therefore quibbling about whether this was a race or gender crime misses the point. The point of school and associated initiations is to humiliate, to bully, and to justify this inhumane behavior in the name of fun. It is violence rendered enjoyable. In other words, during school initiations, otherwise unacceptable behavior is stripped of consequence in a collective contract that allows those to witness and pretend humiliation is harmless. South African Police Services spokesperson Dimakatso Moy told Sonbokuhlem initiation, but they went too far. In other words, even the police believe that it is possible to humiliate with acceptable limits. The problem with this case is its excess, not the fact that violence and degradation are inherently harmful. This is a fascinating double standard in a culture that we are starting to speak more against the bullying of children at school, and where increasing numbers of schools are teaching children to speak up against it and to report it so it can be stopped. The rape lays bare an enactment of power to degrade, humiliate, and break another person. This is the work that rape always does. This is the function of violation. Questions remain even after we understood that the racialized gendered brutality enacted by these boys is not completely out of step with the place of violence elsewhere in South African society. Race and rape intertwine here in obvious ways. A deeply heterosexually violent society that speaks of all penetration as feminization, where the most shameful position a man can assume is to be rendered a woman. This desire to dominate, to render submissive, to render feminine and vulnerable, has echoes of the kind of colonial patriarchal theatre I traced in Chapter 2. What do we make of the public response that posited that this was predominantly about race, those that argued it was really about gender, and the resistance to see it as about both? We can walk and chew gum at the same time. The mother took her child out of the school. Charges were laid against the offending students, who were then removed from the school and placed in another. While the rape survivor had been provided with extensive access to therapy, questions remained about what the school could have done to ensure that the context that enabled this rape is undone. What can the school do with this instance as a lesson in changing the culture of the school? What can other schools do to render what happened at Jan Kempdorp High School an impossibility in others? Any questions? The next case does not involve a school. It is that of 60-year-old farmer from Stutterheim, William Martin Tyndall Knutzer, who groomed and raped 3 children, now aged 9, 11, and 14 over several years. He and his 35-year-old accomplice Also, the mother of the 9-year-old were convicted of 28 charges of sexually exploiting children and trafficking. Both were denied bail since they were taken into custody after the arrest by the Hawks Organized Crime Division on 12 January 2014. Extensively covered in the Eastern Cape newspapers, this case and conviction presented more challenges to what goes on in child rape. The 9-year-old was the first girl Knutse groomed and repeatedly raped with her 35-year-old to bring him 2 other girls for him to rape. He raped one and sometimes forcing them to record. The mother, who was Knutse's co-accused in the court case, argued that he promised to pay for the daughter's education in exchange for sexually violating the child. I am ambivalent about how naming the mother and Knutse's accomplice. On one hand, as a convicted conspirator and accomplice to these crimes of rape, sexual trafficking, and child prostitution, she should be named. On the other hand, naming her identifies her daughter, and in the interest of protecting the privacy of the child, the survivor, her name should be withheld, which I agree with. This quandary about naming the 9-year-old's mother seems to have plagued journalists reporting on the case too, leading the same writers alternating, revealing and withholding it in the news reporting in the court case, according to the SAPS Journal. The 9-year-old was drawn into the ordeal by her 35-year-old mother, who gave her to Knutse for sexual exploitation in return for cash. The girl was told to recruit more girls, which she did. The ordeal went on for a few years before one of the parents was curious about Knutse's vehicle always picking her daughter up without her knowledge. When the mother interrogated the child, she burst into tears before she could open up about the shocking details of her traumatic experiences. HS. It's good to see you. Knutse apparently sexually exploited the children in return for 30 rand. That's like $4 less. On some occasions, one of the girls would video Knutse sexually exploiting her friend. The facts of the case are disturbing and just as challenging for our ideas of how society works. In baby Tsepang's case, her mother was shamed for failing to protect her child. In this case, the decision by the 35-year-old mother to deliberately put her child in danger repeatedly and to further endanger more children defies all understanding in our society of what parental love and responsibility entailed. I do remember, though, that this mother was less shamed than Tsepang's mother in the public eye. In May 2015, they both pled guilty to child prostitution, trafficking, and sexual exploitation. The public response, like quoted commentary by police and court officers, highlighted the palpable shock at a mother who would willingly surrender her child to be raped. The mother's logic of thinking that payment for her education justified her child's rape did nothing to soften the incomprehension. In patriarchal societies, motherhood and mothering are mythologized around inherent empathy, nurturing, selflessness, especially when it comes to a woman and her own children. Here was a mother who defied expectation and logic, a monster mother. However, even if we resist mythical motherhood, reflecting on this child's absolute vulnerability is devastating. How do we understand the story given about what it means to protect children whose own parents make them accessible to predators? The story highlights different parenting choices. It came out and was investigated, prosecuted and resolved because another mother grew suspicious of Knutse's interest in her daughter. This mother, the old white man's interest in the company of children, but did not take Knutse's apparent friendliness at face value because she would not stop asking her daughter, and the child eventually cried and told her mother what was happening. I'm sure she had hoped that her suspicions were mere paranoia. Unlike the first, this one was determined that Knutse be held responsibility for the harm inflicted on these children. Magistrate Ignatius Kitching sentenced Knutse to 15 years for each rape count. Sorry. 15 years for each rape count. 12 years for human trafficking, then offered Knutz's name be added to the sexual offenders registry. As he walked to the holding cells, a teary Knutzer looked at the packed gallery and said, "Dineo Gqola, I'm sorry." His accomplice, the mother of the youngest of Knutz's victims, was sentenced to 12 years for human trafficking charges and 10 years for the sexual exploitation charges, to run concurrently. I'm not sure what kind of sentencing would fit the kind of damage done to these children by Knutzer and his accomplice, and I'm aware that sentencing cannot be determined by public sentiment. Nonetheless, sentences served concurrently, along with 6 years handed to another serial rapist, former tennis star Bob Hewitt, a case to which I now briefly turn, seemed to fly in the face of the crisis. Bob Hewitt, the famous former tennis champion, was also recently convicted of raping several children as he coached at tennis over many years. Erin Bates writes that Hewitt's pedophilia was an open secret in the tennis fraternity that reveals that sources close to the case say many more possible victims of Hewitt's abuse who live in South Africa, the US, and New Zealand have not come forward with the details on alleged assaults that occurred when he was their adult tennis coach and they were minors. 75-year-old Hewitt was sentenced to 6 years. 6 years. In prison and a payment of 100,000 rand to fund campaigns against violence against women and children. That is a drop in the fucking ocean. 100,000 rand to him is pocket change. The sentence was for the rape of his 2 students, Celine Shehan and Teresa Tolkien, now adults. The indecent assault of a complainant who may not be named. Judge Bert Bam noticed that he was convinced that the state has built a strong case, pointing out that in the case of rape of a minor, the accused would normally face a life sentence, but because the crimes occurred in the 80s and 90s, legislation at the time did not have a minimum sentence. He said that the punishment has to fit both the criminal and the crime, and mercy is always an element the court should consider. It was because he was a tennis star and because he was white. That is literally why. Brock Turner much. The judge seems to be saying that he was unable to sentence Hewitt to a much higher sentence because of the complications posed by the period during which the crimes were committed. The last sentence in the excerpt above suggests the judge wanted to show both the importance of being punitive and having mercy on Hewitt. But Hewitt didn't have mercy on his victims. He belongs under the jail. The judge noticed that Hewitt had shown no remorse from the 1980s by assaulting another student in the 90s, that although he was not concerned with Hewitt reoffending because of his age, retribution was necessary, noting at first sending a man to be an octogenarian to a prison sentence would be an incredibly severe punishment, but it was not common in South African law. And second, the younger Hewitt would have received more than 20 years behind bars. Whereas Hewitt had attempted to use his age as a mitigating factor in sentencing, the judge dismissed this by declaring no rapist or violator of children should be able to hide behind their age. But still, you gave him 6 years. You're fucking complicit. The judge seems to be saying that Hewitt could be sentenced to more, although not a life sentence, if he were younger, and that age should not be an excuse. Sports bodies responded swiftly to Hewitt's court case. In 2012, Mark Stenning, executive director of the International Tennis Hall of Fame in Boston, was quoted as saying that a unanimous decision to suspend Hewitt was reached by the 25-member executive committee. The Australian-born Grand Slam champion who moved to South Africa after marrying a South African was a powerful man that parents paid to coach their children in an attempt to give them the best possible opportunities. Instead, he used his power to groom, assault, and rape some of these girls. Although some of the children he abused spoke to global media outlets, only 3 came forward for the trial. It's worth noting that the cases discussed in this chapter are not the norm of cases in child rape. Where evidence is collected, testimony found that is deemed reliable and sufficient to secure a conviction. Dumisile Nala, executive officer at Childline South Africa, insists that rapists and other sex offenders walk free because if a prosecutor feels that the child is not ready to testify, we encourage them to refer them to us. We would then spend time in therapy with the kids. This has to be done with great sensitivity. Eventually, when we build trust, we explain to them why they have to go to court, who they will see there, and what would be expected from them. When accused sex offenders are released, they often return to the communities where they committed the crimes and tell communities they have been vindicated by the court. The children have to live with the trauma of having their abusers close by again. But they too want to move on with their lives, so we rarely see these charges against reoffenders reinstated after the children reach an age where they can testify more comfortably. Children who speak of their rape are in a precarious position, according to Nala, since many have to live to see their rapist walk free. Many prosecutors do not request assistance from those qualified to work with children. Consequently, many children's rapes are thrown out of court since young children may make unreliable witnesses, especially in the absence of DNA evidence. Prosecutors decide that a case cannot be made. The Sitkalo settlement community in Mitchell's Plain, about which Daniel Knutzer writes, Child Rape Case, How Poor Families Struggle for Justice, had discovered that Madala, a man in his 70s, admired by the community because he loved children and considered the communal grandfather had been raping at least 3 girls between 5 and 7 years old. The community responded with rage on the discovery, dismantling and burning his shack and belongings, banishing him from the community. When faced with the prosecutors' and NPA's frustration at the answers given by the small children, and therefore the prospect of seeing Madala escape prosecution and being set free, the community members approached Childline South Africa, who were able to assist. Through examining various cases of child rape that successfully went to court, several things emerged. First, it is that children are not raped by monsters. They are raped by those entrusted with their safety. Nice men who seem grandfatherly, a mother's boyfriend, schoolmates, celebrated sportsmen, their mother's employer who has children the same age. Child rapists are not monsters, nor are they all necessarily young men from impoverished backgrounds. It is difficult to create a reliable profile of a child rapist, as the diversity in this chapter shows. There is more diversity in the real world than I've been able to capture here. The rapist is also often a family member, not just someone considered family. Although children are set up in the credibility/plausibility connection as the most believable rape survivors, this does not always translate to harsh sentencing. Children may be unable to testify for themselves in ways that ensure conviction, and consequently their cases may stall. Contrary to public gender talk, there is no significant difference between those who rape adults and those who rape children. It may be young adults or old men, poor men or wealthy, powerful men, peers or those who are idealized in their communities. Those who rape babies, their grooming is used. At the same time, although child and baby rapes are often presented as the most horrendous forms of rape, a comparison that is in itself problematic, sentencing is not necessarily harsher for those convicted. Indeed, in August 2011, a submission by Nicole Fritz for the South African Litigation Center showed that Justice Mogoeng, then nominated to the top position at the Constitutional Court, which he currently held by the time of publishing, had a record of minimizing child rape, with Fritz quoting the Esfers Sebayang case in 2007, where Justice Mogoeng had noted that the 14-year-old survivor had not acted as though her pain was real, must have been mindful of her tender age, thus so careful as not to injure her privates, except accidentally when he penetrated her. That would explain why the child was neither sad nor crying when she returned from the shop, notwithstanding the rape. In addition to the tender approach that would explain the absence of serious injuries and the absence of serious bleeding, he bought her silence and cooperated with Simba chips and 30 rand. In another case this time, as for Serekwane, in 2005, Mogoeng had concurred with the reduction of a 5-year sentence to a 3-year sentence for the rape of a 7-year-old, noting that the injury, although there was no direct evidence, led she must have suffered some psychological trauma as a result. These are just twigged in how a rape judgment fails vulnerable children. There are many other similar cases of sentences reduced because it wasn't that serious. And that's the chapter. Any questions? Thank you, Terrell. I shall see you all on Tuesday. Hope you have a good weekend.